Mr. President, do you think that NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace?
Yes, I do.
That was a pretty big statement. What might it mean? It has become quite realistic to assume that NATO would shoot down a Russian aircraft, particularly a drone, but even a manned aircraft, if it encroached on NATO airspace. Because in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of encroachment. So we saw 19 drones into Poland, we saw a drone into Romania, and particularly 3 Russian MiG-31s flying into Estonian airspace. NATO won't always just shepherd these vehicles out of its airspace. It's said repeatedly it will defend every inch of NATO's airspace. And ultimately, that means that if these encroachments continue, they'll have to shoot something down.
Our message to the Russians is clear. We will defend every inch of Allied territory. We will make sure that we can always defend and deter where necessary. We are a defensive alliance, yes, but we are not naive. So we see what is happening, and whether it is intentional or not. If it is not intentional, then it is blatantly incompetence. Even if it is incompetence, we still have to defend ourselves.
There has been a case where a NATO country shot down a Russian jet in 2015. Turkey shot down an Su-24 Russian bomber that was on its way back from bombing in Syria. And an F-16 from the Turkish Air Force shot it down. The Turkish air defense system warned the pilot 10 times that he had to get out of Turkish airspace. The pilot didn't respond, so they shot it down. The result was that the Russians went berserk, but they didn't act against it in any way, because I think they effectively recognized that it was their mistake. It is conceivable that Ukraine could reoccupy some of the ground that it's lost to Russia, certainly since 2022. Whether it could regain all of the ground it lost after 2014 is a different question, because that would include Crimea. That's a separate problem. But the idea of pushing the Russians back towards their 2022 start lines, if we can call them that, is not impossible if the Ukrainians had enough ammunition and the right sort of equipment and can buy themselves enough time to train a new army that can conduct those sorts of offensive operations. NATO has not infringed on Russian airspace in the last 10 years in ways that have ever become public. I mean, if they ever did, the Russians would make quite something of it, and that has never happened. On the other hand, NATO aircraft and ships certainly go up to the boundaries in the way that the Russians do, because they want to explore what those boundaries are. They want to have a good look at what the Russians are doing. But satellite surveillance and satellite photography actually performs a lot of the functions that years ago aircraft would have needed to perform in trying to fly over hostile territory. But they can now see quite a lot of what they want to see from satellites. One of the most important elements of President Trump's statements is that it may help the morale of Ukrainian armed forces. Their morale has been very poor for the last 6 months for understandable reasons. They felt that they were increasingly on their own, that they were fighting a war that they were losing slowly, that those on the front line were just waiting to be killed. That morale may now change if there is a sense that the United States would back Ukraine in some way to carry on the war, that the Europeans are more determined to help Ukraine in the way that they need to be helped, and that the Russians can be pushed back. That sense of greater optimism is something that's really important in the morale of fighting troops and of the population in Ukraine, who have said that they're fed up with the war, they want the war to end, but they also don't want to be conquered by Russia. This is a big switch in rhetoric from President Trump. We don't know what it will mean in practical terms, but one thing it does mean is that he has taken a different view of his relations with Russia and his personal relationship with President Putin. Until yesterday, he seemed always to hold on to the idea that he could persuade Putin. It's 5 weeks since the Alaska summit in which Putin persuaded him. And everything that's happened since now seems to have persuaded President Trump that this war is a much more complex problem than he thought it was. Before he became president this time round, he said on 53 separate occasions, 53 occasions, that he would end this war in 24 hours. He now knows he can't end it in 24 hours, and there's a degree of humility, even if it's not entirely obvious, a degree of humility in his acceptance that this war is something that will not come to an easy conclusion.